But today we have a awesome, very special guest today. He's the author of the new book titled Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. Christian Despina, welcome to the show. If you want to follow him on Twitter, which is Martyr1776. Great follow and just an overall great guy. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, thanks, Stephen. I appreciate it.
Okay, I am so excited to have you on. It's great. Your book is fantastic, and this channel in general is dedicated to talking about little known people and events in American history. And I think Dr. Joseph Warren is a perfect person to talk about in regards to that, because not a lot of people really know who he is, and I think he deserves a lot more credit than he deserves. So, in like a little bit like a one or two, sentence, 1 or 2 minute kind of brief introduction, who was Dr. Joseph Warren, and how did you get interested in him?
All right. So, really, before there was George Washington, there was Dr. Joseph Warren. So Warren is president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, head of the Committee of Safety. He's the Grand Master of ancient Scottish Rite Masons throughout North America. He delivers 2 fiery Boston Massacre orations. He authors the Suffolk Resolves. He's a propagandist. He's writing political arguments and tracts. He's a spy master. He sends Revere and Dawes out on their midnight rides. I mean, he's really doing it all voice, pen, and sword. And that's why he's such an important figure, but in the pre-revolutionary era. And I think so many histories kind of trace the starting point of the revolution either to the massacre or the Tea Party. But for 10 years before the Declaration of Independence is signed, Warren is resisting these oppressive British policies. And what got me into the book, I mean, I had always heard about Warren's name. You know, it's just a sentence here, a sentence there. You never read much about him. I think at the time there were 2 full-length nonfiction biographies written about him in over 200 years. And, you know, you start thinking, you know, he's wearing all these hats. He's doing all these things. He's participating in these battles and skirmishes. You know, why don't we know more about him? Why is someone like Paul Revere a household name, but the guy who actually sends Paul Revere on the ride, the one who's responsible for this shot heard around the world, nobody's heard anything about him, and he's just obscure.
He is truly a Renaissance man, and in all sense of the word, I think he's very much like a lot of the founders. They have multiple hats, they do a lot of things, but Warren, to me, I think is distinctly different, and you really show that in the book. And you do something in the book that is just remarkable. You have this guy who did all these things, and unlike Revere, Washington, all rest of the founders, they all have their writings intact. Warren's writings are either burned, they were destroyed, because he was just all over the place, and he was one of the most wanted men in Boston during the time. So how challenging was it for you to kind of collect all this together, put a good biography of his life with that lack of kind of primary sources that were not really available to you?
Right, and we know the 1-2 punch that really the British had focused on was, right, Samuel Adams, John Hancock. But the British officers, the royal officials, they're aware of exactly who Warren is. Part of the problem is that a lot of his activity is really shrouded in secrecy, right? So we know he is at the top of the ladder for these intelligence information to push up the chain. We have new evidence from a book that was published in 2015 talking about someone putting dispatch papers in her dress and delivering them only to Dr. Warren. We have Paul Revere stating that he's monitoring British troop movements and reporting those movements to Dr. Joseph Warren and a few others. So we know that maybe he's actually burning or destroying a lot of his own correspondence. We have that quote from his nephew, Dr. John Collins Warren, who said that late in 1775, that Warren's actually burning a lot of his papers. But then there was this mysterious rumor of this mid-19th century house fire that no one could really pinpoint. And I was lucky to pinpoint 2 mid-19th century house fires where most of his possessions were burned, a lot of his personal papers, letters. And we found this in newspaper, and it talked about actually a slave boy who had run back into the house to try and grab some of these items and possessions and perished in the flames. And they talked about a Colonel Reed who lived across the street from the house, who actually ran in and saved the paintings of Warren and his wife. And the painting obviously now is hanging in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the one that was painted by John Copley.
Wow, so they pulled a Dolly Madison like when they were trying to
Right,
get all the
exactly.
stuff out and everything.
Exactly.
But that is remarkable because Warren, in a sense, is starting the first spy ring of the American Revolution. Like you had like for people who love the AMC show Turn Washington Spies, you had the Culper ring, and then before that, and they alluded to it in the very beginning of the series, you had Nathan Hale, and then before that, you kind of have Joseph Warren having this kind of intelligence ring. And he's kind of like the center point of all this because he's a doctor. He knows all these people around the town. And you kind of show that he's kind of like the focal point of all this stuff that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, right? So this predates George Washington's Secret Six. It predates Nathan Hale. And again, you're not going to have a lot of evidence, right? If someone's actually conducting these spy activities, people are pushing information up the chain of command. But, we have several primary source references talking about them spying on the British, gathering intelligence, and giving this information to Dr. Joseph Warren. So, I mean, and again, it's his decision to send out Revere and Dawes on the ride based on certain intelligence, and he's feeding this information to these founding fathers at the First Continental Congress. He's the eyes and ears of those men there. When you read these letters from the founding fathers in Philadelphia at this time, they're writing to Warren, asking him, what's going on? What should we do? What do you need? They're really relying on him. And when you read these letters, it's amazing to see, wow, these are the founding fathers, and they're really kind of relying on Warren to guide them at this point.
Yeah, exactly. And what's also really remarkable in the book is you kind of talk about Warren about doing everything kind of by the seat of his pants. Like in the very beginning, like you talk about how, he was an avid hunter with his, his family and everything, doing stuff in the humble beginnings. There's no medical schools during the time, so he kind of self-teaches him. He kind of like self-taught teaches himself about how to use vaccinations and everything. So, and even when it comes to spying, he does it all on himself. They have no prior training in regards to this. He has no military training before this. A lot of these guys do. So that's what's really remarkable about him.
Yeah, and I mean, there's no doubt that Warren does do a lot himself. He's also got, a guy like Sam Adams. He's got his grandfather to help mentor him. He's got Dr. James Lloyd to help him. But the amazing thing is that really, Warren does come from these humble beginnings and rises to the top political, military, social circles within the Bay Colony. And that's pretty fascinating for, Puritan Boston that's so hierarchical. And that Warren is like, when you really think about it, he's so much younger than these founding fathers. And they give him a respect that's really kind of amazing for the time, for someone so much younger than, like you said, without the military experience. But, on the flip side of that, you have to realize Warren becomes a gentleman. He becomes wealthy. He's a doctor. He's a Harvard graduate. So he's an attractive candidate because he's really connected to both loyalists and to patriots.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And like I said before, he's very much in the centerpiece of this all. And when you talk about him, I think you also give a great class dimension to this as well, because you talk about how he grew up in a very humble beginnings, but he was able to talk to people in the aristocracy in the Massachusetts area. He was able to talk to the people who were the laymen. When he was a doctor, when that whole smallpox thing was going on, he would give out free vaccinations to people who didn't have the money. So we kind of saw everyone as like on his level. Everyone was a regular person. His idea of equality really was everyone was truly equal in a lot of senses in his eyes.
Well, we know, gauging from his medical records, that he's treating every social rung of that ladder, right? So he's treating ship captains, he's treating slaves, he's treating farmers. He's got patients in there that he calls a lemon seller. He's treating Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor. He's treating, the Oliver family, the Hallowells, the Fluckers. So, again, when you look into his medical world, his business, his career, he really is in all these, you start to draw these concentric circles, right? He's in these different social circles. He's in different military circles. He's with different people who are wealthy, who are poor. And really I think that's what makes him such an attractive figure to both sides of the political battle, because he's someone who's educated. He's someone who's well respected. And think about it, right? He's helping to save people's lives. He's treating them. It's so ironic, because we kind of remember him as a guy who's fighting and killing at Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, but he spends his life trying to save other people's lives and trying to heal other people. So there's sort of this twist of irony involved. He really is a complex figure, right? And
Yes.
You just wish that you had some more of his private letters, and that was the whole point of the book, to try and really dig into his personal life and not so much his public career.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like if anyone knows anything about him, it's just the military stuff, which is just a fraction of the great things that he was doing during that time period. And in regards to the whole class dimension and the, getting around the society, one thing you mentioned in this book, which I absolutely loved, was you talking about the land bank system, which we would kind of call like public banking today. And it's so fascinating, because I've been fascinated in the kind of public banking systems that used to kind of exist, and some people are calling for it to come back today. What was the land bank system, and how did it relate to Warren and the American Revolution?
So basically, in a nutshell, there was a shortage of hard money in the Bay Colony in the late 1730s, early 1740s. So a group of men get together and decide that they're going to create this land bank, which is basically paper currency, right? They will accept notes of currency that's going to be backed by land. Now, the problem is these wealthy merchants, these wealthy politicians, they want to concentrate the money in their hands. They don't want people doing this. So they reach out to Parliament for help in dissolving the land bank. Now, when you read biographies about Samuel Adams, talk to historians about Samuel Adams, a lot of them will point to this land bank controversy as to one of the reasons that Samuel Adams became such a vehement patriot, because his father was one of the principal investors and founders of this land bank controversy. Now, Parliament is successful in dissolving the land bank, and this spells financial ruin for so many of the men who were involved. And what we really didn't know before this was that one of the principal investors was Dr. Joseph Warren's maternal grandfather, who he becomes very close with. So from the early 1740s until his death in the 1760s, this Dr. Samuel Stevens, Warren's grandfather, is being dragged into court. He's being sued. Basically, it's a financial disaster for him. He has to sell tracts of land, personal possessions, farm animals. He's pleading to the courts for help, for relief, saying he has no more money. He's basically sold everything. So Warren would have seen this growing up. Now, think about it. When his grandfather does die in the 1760s, Warren's in his 20s. So Warren saw this firsthand. So you can see this is really one of the first instances of Parliament dipping their fingers into the colonists' pockets to help dissolve this land bank. And really, this would have, you have to think it would have caused a lot of resentment on Warren's part to see his grandfather suffer like this. And as a consequence, his own family.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I read an article recently about the land bank system, and Benjamin Franklin loved these things. He was saying how much that it kind of balanced out, the farmers able to have their own money with the merchants. It was kind of like that separation that used to exist in banking, which was called Glass-Steagall, which had private commercial banks and investment banks separated. And Franklin used to talk about how when Parliament was kind of deviating themselves into this manner, that they were like, the colonists were starting to get a little bit worried. And when I think they had that Coinage Act, I think in 1764 or something along those lines, the colonists got even more worried that they were having to use hard money, which meant that they were going to be indebted, which is, I that connection that you made. And it's such a kind of complicated thing to talk about. And
yes,
you simplified it. So I thought magnificently, like the best I've ever kind of read about it, which was great.
Yeah, well, it's because I'm not that smart, so.
No. It was perfect.
Really,
it was great.
You said it in a nutshell. It was such a complex system. And when you're doing the research and you're reading like hundreds of pages of this stuff and then trying to connect it and see who the people are involved, but eventually you can connect the dots and see who the principal figures in this were and who really suffered. And then to find these follow-up documents from these court suits and the Suffolk County probate records, and you start
Right.
realizing, wow, he saw all this, his family lived through this. No wonder this, because really, Warren joining the Patriots, I always say this, it was really the equivalent of financial suicide, because he gets so much financial patronage from guys like Thomas Hutchinson and these loyalists, these Crown officials in Boston.
Yeah, that was a very interesting aspect of the book, about how he's just torn between kind of both of these, but he always knows what side he wants to go to. But again, like it does ruin his business, it ruins his family. I basically said at the end about this book to my mom, I'm like, this is almost like a Shakespearean tragedy. I mean, it's, the guy has everything, and then he kind of, dies with nothing, and his family almost dies with nothing, pretty much. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No. And I became very close with Joseph Warren's fifth great grandson, George Wildrick, who was the family historian.
Oh,
and
excellent.
really, before this, everybody thought the direct descendants had died out, but they didn't. So him and I had become very close. And, when we talked about how I was going to end the book and talk about the suffering of how the children suffered and the whole family, I mean, you really see it hit home, because it's not just it's not just a statue. It's not just a person who's a painting. Like, it really took life for me, because here I am talking with one of his descendants and talking about his grandparents and his great grandparents and how they suffered and how the children suffered. And I'm telling you, it just brought it home to me. It took on a personal bent at that point, that how devastating it was at the end. And as you eloquently put it, like a Shakespearean tragedy.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that really motivates you to do a really good job at this as well. It motivates you. You want to honor not just the person in the past, but honor their present, family members. So
Right.
definitely. So on that, in regards to that, could you explain the Suffolk Resolves and how that was kind of a precedent to the Declaration of Independence? Because this is very fascinating as well.
Yeah, and again, in a nutshell, this is a declaration of rights and grievances that Warren authors because of these coercive acts that have passed as a result to punish the colonists for the Tea Party, right? And one of the biggest one was closing the port of Boston. And we have this letter that's written by Warren's fiance, that was written the day the port is being closed, and it's almost catastrophic through her eyes, right? How is this town of Boston, how is this colony going to survive if we're basically, it's a stranglehold on their economy? So the incredible thing is that, on one of his lesser famous rides, Paul Revere is chosen by Warren to dispatch this document to the Continental Congress. And what's always amazing to me is that when Revere arrives, this is in September of 74, we know that the assembled delegates are not all on the same page, right? There's a lot of divisiveness, there's a lot of bickering, but the incredible thing is that every single delegate to the Continental Congress adopts these Suffolk Resolves unanimously. And that's why when people say, well, the founders didn't know who Warren was, well, they all knew who Warren was. They all admired him to an extent because of these Suffolk Resolves, because he creates this atmosphere of harmony and unity at this First Continental Congress, and they ride that through. So, it really is a precursor document to the Declaration of Independence. And if you read some of the language in there and some of the things he's saying, like we must prepare, we have to unite, we have to arm ourselves. I mean, these are really radical things at this time period that not a lot of people are saying. Keep in mind the Declaration is going to come about a year and a half later. But, at this point, you still have the delegates talking about olive branch petitions.
Yes.
The colony of Massachusetts is becoming a problem, making problems for everyone else. So when you really look at this document in hindsight, it really is an incredible piece of work.
Yeah, that dynamic that you just talked about is really shown very well in the John Adams miniseries. I think there's a section where they're debating in the Southern colonies. I just talked about this actually in a recent episode, talking about the recent controversial thesis about slavery and the American Revolution. And that is, the Southern delegates really don't want to go to war with these guys, but the Massachusetts delegates, the New England delegates are kind of ready. And one of the things that John Adams states in the Continental Congress, I don't know if it was based on something he actually said, but it was like, my physician, the guy I went to, get cured from, was shot through the head at Bunker Hill. Like, do we still want to make peace at this point? And it sounds like his death very much was just a rallying cry for these guys to really start breaking off.
Yeah, and I think it sent shockwaves. I mean, Washington gets the news of Warren's death and the Battle of Bunker Hill as he's traveling to Cambridge. I think he's somewhere in New York when he gets the news. And then basically all the delegates at the Continental Congress get word of Warren's death a week after the battle. And really, Warren had no business being at this battle. I mean, I think it's just as ludicrous to expect like our major politicians going over to Afghanistan and fighting in tanks and doing troop movements as it was back then. And everyone who Warren knew implored him not to go to this battle, not to risk himself, because he was so important, because he wore so many hats, and because these guys were way in Philadelphia, he becomes the on-the-ground leader. And you really see it create this vacuum. And even I think it was like even 20 years later, a play had been written and Warren was in it, and John Adams was president at the time, and the play was in New York City, and he basically states like, you depict Warren as a bully. And he was really offended by that. But I think you're right. I think a lot of these guys, once they found out how Warren's body was treated, once they found out he was killed, I think that was a real turning point where there really is no turning back at this point for a lot of the guys, that they're just repulsed by this.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think you eloquently said that very, very much right there about how, modern day politicians going out to fight for their, for their country, it seemed ludicrous then. And even a very much a Washington characteristic that Warren held at the battle that I think you wrote in your book is that even though he was promoted to brigadier general, something along those lines, he goes to the battle and he says, "No, I'm going to let Putnam and I'm going to let the rest of those guys, let this have them be in command, and I'm just going to fight with the regular soldiers." Like, that's amazing. Like, some guy that has been anointed into a general says, "I'm not going to take it. I'm going to fight with the rest of these guys." And he's like, what? He's only 26.
He's 30. He's 34. He had just
34. Excuse me, 34. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the amazing thing is that so Warren shows up. He's about 2 decades younger than Putnam and Prescott, and they're offering him command of the field. And when you think about it, Warren's really the only leader who's a Massachusetts guy there, right? These are both Connecticut guys. So nobody's going to know that terrain better than Warren at that time.
Right.
But he shows up and says, "Tell me where the worst part of the fighting is going to be, and that's where I'm going to go." And the fact that he has 4 orphan children, right? Because his wife had died a couple of years before. He's got 4 young kids. And the fact that he goes there, and the issue that I took with a lot of the histories was when they depicted Warren at Bunker Hill, he basically is there as a cheerleader, right? He's egging on the troops, but no, let's really break this down. He shows up, right? He refuses to take overall command of the field and to fight as a volunteer. He's armed with a pair of pistols, a sword, a rifle. He's there fighting. And when it gets overrun and the fighting turns into some of the most archaic, beating each other with fists, stones, clubs, the butts of their guns, he stays until the last seconds to make sure that his men retreat and they get out alive. Now, just think about I might have soiled myself. Really think about that. Think about the nerve that took for a guy who's not a military guy, right? Who was involved in some battles and skirmishes for the last few months, but he doesn't have any formal military training. And the fact that you look at a guy like that and say, this is how much this meant to him. So he wasn't just doing it with the words, right? He's not just writing the polemical arguments and delivering these orations, but he's actually backing it up with his actions. And that's rare. That's why I always say, voice, pen, and sword. I mean, this guy is doing it all, and it's impressive.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, in regards to the modern day depictions of him, I guess just modern day, how we see him, are there any places that are named after him? How many statues are of him in the United States? Do you know?
Yeah, there's 4 that I know of. There's one in Warren, PA. There's one at the Bunker Hill Monument inside. There is one that's at Roxbury Latin School. that's right outside, and that's Warren's alma mater. And then there was one that was just dedicated at his burial place in Forest Hill Cemetery, and that was just dedicated about 4 years ago by the Freemasons of Massachusetts. So there's actually 4 statues that exist to him now. And whenever you really see a Warren County, a Warren Street, a Warren Avenue, 99 times out of 100, it's going to be named after him.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of a common name in the United States. It's not very much common. I mean, it's funny enough that the current Massachusetts senator has the last name of. I don't think there's any relationship to her from him, though. I don't think.
It's so funny. I'll get people coming up to me and saying, is he related to her? And when I say no, half the people go, "Oh, shucks," and the other half, breathe a sigh of relief. So it's just funny to the reactions,
Yeah, you're living in one of the most partisan times in American history. So when you say something along those lines, you're going to get a mixed reaction.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, but I think her family's actually from like Oklahoma or like the West or something along those lines. So I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah,
it is funny that Joseph Warren's wife is named Elizabeth.
Right,
Warren
exactly.
Well. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's funny. But Enrique, I had to put that out there. But in terms of like media and how he's depicted now, the first time I ever heard about Joseph Warren was through Liberty's Kids, actually, growing up, and the depiction of him, I thought, if I'm remembering correctly, was pretty good. Like, it wasn't like, I don't think they had any, I remember, I think like Sylvester Stallone played, Paul Revere, and they had like all these, but I don't remember who the guy who played him in the series, but I thought he was pretty well done. I don't know if have you seen that yet, or?
No, I haven't. So I'm older than you. So
yeah.
I'm kind of in between the Liberty's Kids and the Johnny Tremaine.
Right, and he's depicted in that movie too, right? How is he depicted in that? Do you know?
No, I thought he was depicted really well. I mean, it's been years since I've seen that Liberty's Kid, but I think Warren really starts to fall into obscurity after that 100-year centennial of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And then, Disney does this Johnny Tremaine. You have that book by Esther Forbes, and Dr. Walter Coy is playing Dr. Joseph Warren. So you get that, and then you kind of shift to the Liberty's Kids. And then more recently, you've had that Sons of Liberty on the History Channel.
I was just going to ask you about that, because in that series, it is such a historically awful series. Historically inaccurate. I might do an episode about how horribly inaccurate that series is. But in the series, it's depicted. I think the guy is named Ryan Eggold or something along those lines. He's an NBC actor kind of guy.
I'm going to cut you off for a second.
Go for it. No, go for it.
I did a talk at Francis Tavern, and after I did the talk about Warren, I met up with a couple of my cousins, and we go to this restaurant that the guy who owns it is a family friend, and we're sitting there, and my cousin says, "Oh, that guy looks familiar in the corner there." He had just walked in, and I'm looking, and I said, "Yeah, he does look familiar. Who is it?" And it was Ryan Eggold. So I went up to him, and I signed a book, and I gave it to him, and I thought he did a good job. Again, it was grossly inaccurate. I thought the scenery was great, but it was kind of hard to see the kid from E.T., who's supposed to be Samuel Adams, who's about 15 years younger than Adams was, like jumping on rooftops, And
he has like a scruffy beard. He looks like he looks like me playing Sam Adams, And I'm like, I do not look like Sam Adams. I'm sorry.
Right, exactly.
And exactly. But in the series, there is a section that talks about Thomas Gage's wife. And there has been this thing, I guess it's just a thesis lately, about Gage's wife potentially gave Warren these secret plans or something along those lines. And in the series, they have this thing where they have like this romantic relationship. Is there any kind of like water to is there anything to that at all, or what do you think?
No, and this this has been and this is some of the problem, and this is how you have to balance the scale out, right? So Warren's a little bit in pop culture, and is it better that he's getting some airtime, but then you say, well, when these events are fictionalized, it sort of metastasizes in the literature, and people start to think it's real. But no, that was not true, and I can't take credit for that. A really good friend of mine, J.L. Bell, who runs that Boston blog, Boston 1775.
Yeah, check that out. It's really
was
good.
The first. You should have him on the show. I mean, he did a great book, The Road to Concord. But he disproved that. And I think where it started was from, there was a quote back then that said, alluded to the fact that Warren had a source of intelligence, and it was a quote, a daughter of liberty unequally yoked in the point of politics. So, a couple of historians, grabbed onto that, and, some made it into a salacious kind of thing, where all of a sudden it turned into Margaret Kemble Gage, who was from a patriot family, and all of a sudden Warren's having this relationship with her, and she's feeding him all this information. But
I don't know how the heck can you get that one sentence of talking about a daughter of liberty within like the political area, and then turn it into Thomas Gage's wife.
I could see how initially it made sense, because you had some real serious historians who speculated about it and said, this could have been one of the women that was feeding Warren information. But then you had some other people come along and start making these innuendos that there could have been a romantic relationship, and that's how these things breathe life. But no, it was disproven. We still don't know who the daughter of liberty was. I speculated that it could have been Lucy Flucker, Henry Knox's wife. J.L. Bell disagrees with me, so we're a little
you're butting heads there.
A little bit over that, but J.L. Bell's scholarship. No one's doing it like him, but I think there is a possibility that could be. John doesn't agree with me, but we don't know. That's the bottom line. But yeah, again, there is no truth to that rumor that it was, and Sons of Liberty, as you said, isn't Warren sleeping with her or something?
It's something. Yeah, it's something like that. I remember just seeing that, and I was just like, oh, this. I'm like, I can't even remember how old I was. I must have been like 20 or 21. I'm like, this can't be real. Like, I was just like, I remember reading about Warren as like, I'm like, he wasn't like this. Like, especially, I was like, even reading your book, I'm like, that claim, and making it into like that kind of, movie, it degrades the love that he had for his what's her name, the woman who he married after his wife died.
Mercy Scully.
Exactly.
And his family was upset about that, because there was some writings about talking about Warren having these relationships with all these different women, and you said it kind of cheapens the legacy, and if there's no look. We're not here to sanitize Warren's character, right? Look, I did 20 years of research. You can't help but build a huge respect and admiration for a man, but you really try and be as objective as you can, right? And Warren did have faults, but look, don't you think it would have been great if he had this like illicit relationship, and you can put it in the book and sell more copies, but look, if it's not there, if there's no proof, it's really hard to put that in there. If there's nothing to anything, if there's no document, if there's no letter, if there's no one else saying it, look, we all speculate, we all have speculative questions, but it has to be based on something. And then we can say, look, this is our opinion. We think this might have happened because of A, B, and C. You can't just say, hey, this happened.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. I remember there was a show on the History Channel talking about like the illicit secrets of the founding fathers or something like that. And they talked about like the Freemasonry and everything. And at one point they accused Washington of almost having an affair with Nathaniel Greene's wife or something along those lines. And I was like, there is nothing in the literature that accuses Washington of this. We could talk about Washington owning slaves. We could talk about Washington and all the faults that he had, but you can't make something like that up. You know what I mean? So,
and wasn't there a book that came out about Lincoln claiming that Lincoln was a homosexual?
Yeah, it was something along that was just like a thesis that they had about, I think it was like him and Joshua Speed or something along those lines. Larry, I think there was the famous AIDS activist Larry Kramer made a book about how there was a ton of these people throughout American history who were definitely like secretly gay or something along those lines. And it was, the list just went on. It was like George Washington to, to like FDR, you know what I mean? And it was just like, this is, there, you could make certain speculations. Like, I think the Hamilton thing about him being bisexual, that as actual, that has actual claims to it, but you can't go overboard with it.
It's funny because I have a friend of mine and she's working on a biography about one of Warren's proteges, and she sent me a couple of chapters, and there's some strong proof that you think that, I think this guy could have been a homosexual. And you really, look, I think they talked about it back then, that if you were caught or uncovered, like it was punishable by death.
Right.
So
In some areas it
obviously
was.
these men had to be careful. But again, you just see. I think it just proves over and over again that when you're looking at this time period in history, you really have to look at it from an 18th century mindset and not a 21st century mindset.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's called presentism. You can't have the standards that we have today and put them on certain people, but nonetheless some people just kind of get carried away with it in general.
Right.
But I wanted to tie that into Warren because I just remember seeing that whole thing with the affair and I was just like, this is this no.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. And a last thing I wanted to talk to you about is you set up with a bunch of other people the Joseph Warren Historical Society, if I'm correct about the name. Could you explain a little bit about it?
I can't really take credit. It was my colleague, who's Randy Flood, and he came to me after the book had been published, and he said, I've long been an admirer of Dr. Joseph Warren. And he said, I see that you're trying to go around the country and talk about his legacy, and you're connected with his direct descendants, and they're trying to get word out there about him. He said, did you ever think about starting a historical society? And I said, no, I haven't. So what we did was we spoke to a couple of dozen people. We started to form a website. We started reaching out to other historical societies and museums and other authors and other scholars. And really, it's also about the commemorative anniversaries coming up, right? Because the country's focused on 2026, but by 2026, everything Warren had done and had been a part of is really going to kind of be a blip on the radar. I mean, I'm sure they'll give the Tea Party some traction, but really, think about it, right? The Boston Massacre, 250, that kind of ran into a brick wall because of the COVID, and we were gaining a lot of traction. We're going to have a Dr. Joseph Warren annual symposium. We're going to give out scholarships in his name. And so we thought, why don't we do some Zoom interviews with some authors about the smallpox, since it's so timely. And I think we've done about 12 interviews so far, and we keep giving talk. We just did a virtual talk in Virginia Beach, Randy and I. And so basically, that's the mission, to try and preserve Warren's legacy and kind of separate the fact from fiction and talk about these events, because I really think, it's not just about Warren. It's about all these events leading up to 1776. I really think it's an underappreciated period in American history. So we're trying to do that. And we just launched the website. It's www.drjosephwarrenhistoricalsociety.org. So if anyone's interested, they can check it out.
And there you go. Got a fan right here. So that's excellent. That's excellent. No, but I think you're absolutely right about, celebrating this. I don't know what the 250th. I don't know what that actually is, but it's
some semi-sesquicentennial.
Yeah. It's something I can't even pronounce.
It's above my pay grade too. So.
Right, exactly. It's older than both of us combined, so that's all you gotta know about. But I totally agree. I think all these events that should be put in the spotlight should be getting a lot more attention, and hopefully by next year COVID will be gone, and we can really celebrate a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, seriously.
And I'm going to get my Patriot outfit and I'm going to be ready. So
all right.
I was going to say that was the last thing, but one last thing actually.
Sure.
Do you have any other works that you're thinking about doing on expanding upon this, or anything else you're working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm always working on Warren. I just put together a whole thing about how timely this is with the smallpox, and how smallpox really devastated Boston, and how there were bankruptcies and all kinds of stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I'm still working on Warren. We're still doing the Historical Society. One of the things that fascinated me about Warren, and anytime I give a talk, most of the questions I get about his post-mortem journey. And I got to tell you, Stephen, you would not believe how many gems of information I was able to gather just by studying 100 years after Warren's life, by digging into the personal letters and journals of his nephews, of his brother, of all, you just can't believe how much information you were able to glean. So I'm kind of working on a project like that now about these post-mortem journeys, and just to see what I can dig up, because for me, it's all about trying to find things that no one's ever found before. So.
Well, I'm looking forward to it all, and hopefully my audience will as well. And we thank you so much again for coming on. The book is Founding Martyr: The Life and death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's lost hero. Christian, thank you so much for being
I
on.
really appreciate it, Stephen. Thank you, brother.
Thank you. No problem. We really appreciate it.